Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our Bringing Birmingham to You webinar called Beautiful Brains Shaping Neurodiverse Futures. My name is Laura Crane, and I'm Professor of Autism Studies based in the University of Birmingham School of Education, where I'm also the Director of the Autism Centre for Education and Research, or ACER. And I'm really delighted to have been asked by our alumni office to be the host of this webinar and have the pleasure of welcoming all of our alumni and friends from all over the world to this very special event. Before we begin, I just have a few important things to mention to you. So first, you may like to know that this webinar will be recorded. So this means you're welcome to return to the recording at a later stage and also to share it with others. But do rest assured that only the speakers will be captured on the recording. Also, all attendees' cameras and microphones will be disabled during the webinar. But despite that, we would really love to hear from you. So do feel free to use the chat function throughout the webinar. You are very welcome to submit your questions there, or alternatively, there's a little Q&A box and you can put your questions there and we'll do our very best to try and answer as many as we can this evening. In terms of the webinar itself, Bringing Birmingham to You is an event series from the Alumni Office, which brings Birmingham academics and some of our brilliant supporters together to share with our global alumni community, as well as to broader friends of the university. And through our panelists sharing their insights through informal conversation, will hopefully give you all a really brilliant opportunity to hear from some of the people leading the way in the field. And on behalf of the Autism Centre for Education and Research, I just want to say how proud we are to be featured at this evening's event. While we're based in a school of education and while we do lots of research about how to make schools more inclusive to autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people, we also recognise the need for enabling inclusive supporting environments to extend beyond school and into the workplace. And while we at ACER have a specific focus on autism, our event today recognises autism as one of many forms of neurodivergence. Now, I'm not going to give a lecture on neurodiversity or neurodivergence this evening, but just to briefly introduce the topic to our very broad and diverse audience, neurodiversity is the notion that everyone's brains operate in a range of different ways. Most people's brains, so neurotypical brains, work in a broadly similar way. But there's a variety of different forms of neurodivergence, which may include the autistic brain, the ADHD brain, the dyslexic brain, or a combination of these. But the key thing with neurodiversity is the idea that there's no one type of thinking or learning or being that's better than another. And actually, there may be strength in neurodivergent ways of thinking, particularly in a workplace context. And that will be the focus of what we're talking about tonight. And just to add, when we talk about neurodivergence and neurodivergent experiences, I wanted to mention that some people may find certain topics quite challenging. So if that becomes the case, just to say you're very welcome to step out and take a break and rejoin whenever you need to. And you can always catch up on the recording later if that's preferred. So your well-being absolutely is the priority. So just engage with the webinar in a way that works for you. Okay, on to our event. I am really delighted now to be able to introduce you to our really fabulous panel who are going to share their lived experiences as well as some fantastic examples of the brilliant work happening here at Birmingham. So we'll go through our introductions one by one. And first, can I come to Professor Karen Goldberg?
Thank you very much, Laura, and hello, everybody. I can't see you, but it's good to know that you're all here. I'm a professor in autism studies as well and former director of ACER, and I'm also the head of the School of Education here at the University of Birmingham. My research has focused more specifically on educational teaching approaches and practice and making schools more inclusive. And I have had a recent focus on exclusions and attendance in education, which is a very big issue worldwide, although we focused on England in particular, and on the experiences of marginalised families. And I have a particular interest in how technology can support autistic children and young people to learn. So I've got a couple of current projects. One is on using robots to support learning, social communication and interaction in a special school in Norway. And another one is with partners in Luxembourg, where we're working with young children and their families in the home. In my work, I work closely with autistic people themselves and broadly, more broadly, neurodivergent people, families, and practitioners. And I'm particularly keen to bridge the gaps between research and practice. So I have engaged and worked very closely with various partnerships in developing professional development programs for the workforce. And I'm very engaged in policy engagement at the moment and development with the Department for Education in particular. So I've chaired the neurodivergent task and finish group for the Department for Education in England, and I sit on the expert advisory group for inclusion. So we'll come back to some of that, and I know that we will be exploring about how approaches in education and our view of the work that we do in education can have a real bearing on how we think about the workplace as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Richard, could I come to you next, please?
Hello, everybody. I'm Richard Turnbull. I'm a partner at KPMG in Birmingham in the UK. I lead our Midlands indirect tax practice, which, if you translate that to English, means I sit somewhere between a lawyer and an accountant, and I'm autistic. I've been in the professional services consultancy world for about 30 years now, which is quite alarming to admit, to be honest. I'm also married with two young daughters, so lots of fun with that. I was late diagnosed, so I understand the challenges that people have in that area. My medical team has taken to describing me as a super masker, and I think probably some of the way as I present in terms of how I mask probably looks a bit more like people, the way people associate with women, probably because I think I've copied my mum. So hello.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. And last but absolutely not least, could I come to you, Iveta?
Hi everyone, lovely to meet you all. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Iveta, did my undergraduate degree at the University of Birmingham, but more importantly, right now, I run a business, a company called National Neurodiversity Training, NNT, and we wouldn't be here without the university support. Very briefly, what we do, high level overview, we deliver neurodiversity training to help enterprises and companies achieve success. Of course, looking at supporting neurodivergent employees, training for them as well to lean into those strengths and help unmask, just like as Richard said. But as well, seeing managers who want to support but are scared of saying the wrong thing. So that kind of retention, legal compliance, and well-being piece is really important to us. And we've had the pleasure of working with some amazing organizations from Arcadis, delivering training in the US and India and Europe, to even more regionally, working with Transport West Midlands on the first ever research into enabling neurodivergent people to access public transport better so they can get to work. And most recently, kind of partnering with the University of Birmingham, and we'll be launching neurodiversity training for managers in a couple months' time, which we're incredibly excited about. So it's really been a full circle journey. On a personal level, I myself, I'm autistic. I'm also an ADHD, late diagnosed. I really learnt about my own neurodivergence thanks to founding the business and relating to neurodiversity quite a lot, but also thanks to my undergraduate degree at university, all the fantastic support provided. But the signs were quite obvious growing up nonverbal until I was about 6 years old, masking and kind of struggling with my well-being. And so this has been a very empowering journey for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Iveta. Just for the benefit of our audience, what we're going to do now is just go through a few questions with our panel. But please do keep the questions coming in the chat. And once we've gone through our panel discussion, we will then open up to some of the questions coming in. But I'm going to come back to you first, Iveta, to hear a little bit more about your lived experiences. And it would be really lovely to hear more about how neurodivergence shaped your career and your journey, both some of the positives and the negatives.
Definitely. So really interesting stat is that about 52% of business owners are neurodivergent. And I think that's because, well, there's two reasons. One, because different neurodivergent types allow you to lean into your strengths, right? If you're an ADHDer, you seek novelty, urgency. And so when you start a business, you kind of do every single task. One day you're an accountant like Richard, one day you're a lawyer, one day you are developing a product or doing a marketing campaign. That's fantastic for ADHDers. Equally, if you're autistic, you'll be very organized and kind of structured, right? Of course, at this point, we've got a fantastic team and the business has grown. So I've been able to take a step back and focus on one key role. But thanks to that neurodivergence, that's allowed me to really lean into the strengths and recognize that that was or is the ideal role for me, kind of starting a business. Of course, as well, equally being passionate about neurodiversity, experiencing how difficult it is to get a job and kind of go from that education phase to career. About 50% of neurodivergent employees in the UK are actively looking to leave the workplace because of a lack of support, because workplaces aren't accessible. So how can we support them? And that's what we do at National Neurodiversity Training. And having that lived experience is what drove my passion to it. Equally, of course, as well, there are the challenges with it. Myself experiencing those challenges, knowing that a traditional workplace, going to the office every day, would be really inaccessible for me. I have quite strong sensory sensitivity to bright lights. I go non-verbal still till this day, and even doing public speaking or going to networking events, which is a core part of my role, can be difficult because of that inaccessibility, and sometimes I'm unable to do that. So because of that being a challenge, starting your own business, then you can build it in a very accessible way, from the day-to-day structures all the way to how our office is set up. And naturally, of course, most of our company are neurodivergent or disabled. So I've been fortunate to take that challenge and be able to turn it into something positive.
Wonderful. It's brilliant to hear how you've managed to build that structure around you and hopefully provide that for all of your employees as well. And Richard, I'd like to pose the same kind of question to you, really. So as someone who works for an employer rather than being self-employed, but in a leadership role where perhaps you do have a bit more autonomy, could you talk a little bit about your journey to that point? And again, some of the positives and some of the challenges you faced.
Yeah, sure. I suppose it's a little bit about my kind of. So I fell into what I did, and so my academic background was physics and nuclear physics, and I kind of fell into what I do now. And I think in lots of ways, I happen to fall into something that is perfect for somebody who is autistic and in my case also ADHD. Insofar as I started off in a way in the typical career, I took a graduate job and I've worked through every grade up to partner. So I've been both the employee with a little bit less autonomy through to now where you're right, I have a lot of freedom. So there are a few things that I'd pick out within that. And I think my job is very well suited to me because so especially when you start off in a role, it's very technical. And some of the things that I bring as an autistic is I'm very good at holding large quantities of data and making connections between ideas and seeing things that other people don't. I'm also not what you'd associate with someone in finance, but actually there's quite a lot of creativity and curiosity that comes into this. Some of the questions, for example, we have to think about. We give you an idea of how daft some of it is if you pay the mafia, are they a service provider? Protection money. We get into all kinds of strange things like that. So the creativity of thinking is actually really useful. And sometimes things like hyper focus is also very useful. So if I'm preparing for a court case, for example, I can sit and sometimes deliberately trigger a hyper focus mode, and I'll use that to make sure I'm properly on top of all the details. So I've fallen into this role where my job is very varied. And it's not really about, on a better phrase, being present in terms of it's not, people don't need you to clock on at 9:01 and clock off at 5:01 or anything like that. I've always had flexibility, which I think has been important. But one thing to say about developing your career, and I think this is common for neurotypicals as well, it's quite common, especially at more junior levels, that you get promoted for being good at a technical discipline. But actually, as you get promoted and more leadership and management comes into things, the thing that got you promoted is not really the thing that your next job is. So there is that need to learn. And I do think that as you get more senior, some of the challenges we have as autistics come out a bit more in terms of some of the people skills and reading and signals, which makes that progression actually in some ways quite tricky, and it takes quite a lot of work to do that. Now, one thing I did remember to give you an example of that, when I was doing training on sales years ago, there is an experiment that Harvard designed in the 1970s called the still face experiment. And the basic idea is that you get two people talking. One person talks about something they're quite passionate about. What they don't know is the listener is being instructed as the conversation goes on to look increasingly bored and disinterested. We did this as an exercise in a training session. We got to the feedback, and all of the other people were talking about how angry they were feeling at being ignored. And they got to me and I didn't notice. So that I mentioned that just as a kind of a real example of I do struggle to pick up cues of things, and that is something I have to work on quite hard in leadership. So I've always had that technical skill, but I've had to learn other skills and modify some of my natural instincts to actually take on a leadership role. I think I know my team. Some of the things we're going to talk about today, I asked our team about more widely. My personal view is that neurotypicals are probably not, in many ways, as focused on rules and data as autistics. Which, when you come to managing people, fact that someone else is approaching it from a feeling side and you're approaching it from a data and rules side, there's a bit of a clash there. So you do have to learn new skills. And then there is always the thing of managing yourself. There's a phrase I really, really like, which is being autistic is a dynamic disability. It's not like if I lost a leg, that challenge would be there for me all the time. But actually, as an autistic, I can't do the same thing from one day to another. One day, if sensory overload and everything else is completely under control, I can be very capable. The next day, I could be curled up in a ball somewhere. So I really like that phrase, dynamic disability. And it is a challenge in leadership because there is almost an expectation that you're always on and always available for your team. I'm conscious of time here, Laura. Have I spoken for long enough there? Should I leave that there for now?
That is absolutely perfect. And it was interesting actually hearing the overlaps between yours and Avetta's experiences. And it seems like a really important thing that you're both conveying is the importance of really knowing and understanding yourself and where your strengths are and the environments that are most enabling for you and seeking those out. And then being very conscious of where your areas of development are, so that you can put attention into those. So I think that's really, really useful. And I think it brings me nicely actually onto you, Karen. So I know that your research obviously focuses on good practices in autism education, but equally learning is lifelong. And actually hearing from Iveta and Richard, it's made me think a lot about what makes schools enabling for autistic young people. And I think some of those things that I've picked up on are very much, a good fit, really understanding the person, very, very key in education and likely employment too. So my question for you is, what can employers learn from your work around good practice in autism education, and how does that inform the workforce and workforce development?
That's a really good question, and it's been fascinating listening to both Iveta and Richard, and I think it goes the other way as well. What can we learn from the insights of neurodivergent adults who've got to the stage where they are working as partner in a firm or running their own business, and what they think would be important in education? But what struck me was I keep thinking about the fact that we did a kind of a research project which looked at what the evidence base was for good autism practice in education. I think this applies more broadly, actually, to inclusive practice as a whole, to practice for neurodivergent people, whether they're children or adults. And we developed 8 key principles. And I keep thinking about those in relation to the workplace and wondering what Iveta and Richard might think of those, because they are very much around, there's 4 key themes: understanding the individual, positive and effective relationships, building enabling environments, and then learning and development is the 4th theme that we have there. But I've heard both of you talking about the importance of you yourselves understanding your own strengths, but also your own challenges, but also other people understanding your strengths and challenges. And I really like the fact that you emphasize the notion of dynamic disability, Richard. I think that's so, so important. And I often also talk about it being a transactional issue. There are a whole load of things that will influence on how a person reacts or how a person is supported, but it has to be personalized, and it has to be recognized that something might work one day that might not work the other day in terms of how you interact and communicate with a neurodivergent person and support them. But actually understanding that person's strengths and challenges is absolutely crucial in education. So we have a lot of focus on that in education. I think that's equally important in the workplace. Being in a position to contribute and influence decisions, we talk a lot about in education, that we need to involve neurodivergent children and young people much more in contributing and influencing decisions. We would be creating a much better education system for them if we do that. And the notion of positive and effective relationships, I would have thought that, I think from what you're both saying, that having people who you can really interact with well, who understand you, but also potentially having good mentors in the workplace would be really important. That's also very important for children in schools, and to have people that will look out for them, but also people who will collaborate and work with your parents and your professionals. We talk about that in school. In the workforce, that would be teams and external partners, wouldn't it? The notion of professional development, awareness raising, creating an environment of acceptance is absolutely crucial. And what I think is so lovely about the way that both Richard and Iveta talked was really you focused very much on the strengths, but you were very honest about the challenges as well. And if we can become much better at really understanding how valuable it is to have neurodivergent people in the workplace, in the way that it unlocks the creativity, the problem solving, the different cognitive strengths in the way you talk about it, that is fantastic. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to work on within education. And flexibility, we keep pushing on this notion that we have to be so careful about the kind of learning environments we create in schools. We need to have more flexibility in assessments, in curriculum, in learning environments, in the way we teach. And I think that applies to the workplace as well. So I see that being traversing across quite well, really, some of those principles that we need to be operating by.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. And I think it's really nice that one of the things you've really emphasized there, it's not just down to the neurodivergent person to have to make the change. Actually, there's a lot of people in the environment around and structures around the neurodivergent individual that really need attention. So my next question to the panel is really about the support that neurodivergent people need so that they can have thriving and flourishing careers. And I think part of this may also link to a question about adjustments. I know the ideal might be to have a very enabling, inclusive workplace environment, but actually some specific supports may be needed there. So I wonder, Richard, if I come to you first to ask about your experience, and then Iveta, it'd be really great to hear a bit about your work in your organisation and how you're trying to champion that change.
So I think a lot of what Karen said in terms of some of the transfer from school is absolutely correct. I mean, I would absolutely go with what she said in terms of you need a mentor and a support. I mean, one thing I think is probably true for most careers, but as I've been very lucky with, is that you do need somebody who's going to champion you and push you and help you develop to get the next level and to advance in your career. And you can't do it alone. So one thing I always encourage people that work with me to do is two things. One is to say, what do you change? What happens with you here that doesn't happen if you're not? And actually, if you come through to neurodiverse people, there are a lot of things that we do bring there if we're not there. So the first thing is, what can you change? And then the second is just, whose life do you make easier? Because actually, if that person's going to champion you, in most workplaces, people will help someone that they can see is helping them. So I think there is probably some value in if you are in that situation, sitting down and looking at who's around you and saying, actually, who am I helping? Who am I adding value to here? And that person, you've given them a reason to support you and be a mentor. But I think as well, the world has changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years, and I think it's now pretty rare if people reach out and say, can we have a mentoring conversation? Can we have a chat? And I have several people that I do this. It's quite rare for people to say no these days. And it's also getting increasingly rare for organizations to say no when people, I think there's probably more of an expectation on their part, certainly of big businesses, that help will be offered when it's for. Now that said, so I did. We have a neurodivergent community at KPMG, so there's a specific community network group, which I think the last time I checked the numbers was somewhere over 800 people, representing all different types of neurodiversity. So they're a great bunch to kind of ask questions like this of. And I think one of the questions you put is, how are neurodivergent people underserved in the workplace at the moment? Because that then starts to lend you to what you do. First thing is just about psychological safety, which is employers and people. You have to have a situation where people can tell you that what's going on with them and they need help. They have to feel like they can trust that. And one thing you might want to think about is how that also features into interviews and getting jobs in the first place. Because if you are the interviewer, you can only pass or fail somebody based on the evidence that they give you in front of you. And I once had a terrible example where I had to fail somebody. It was somebody who his academic grades fell off a cliff in the second year of university. And I was almost certain it's because his older brother died in a car crash that year. But I couldn't get him to say that. So I had to fail. I got told I had to fail him because I had no evidence that's why it happened. If you apply that to somebody with neurodivergence, it's a big decision to make whether to divulge at an interview stage. But if you don't, you've got to think about, what does that do in terms of the evidence that the person on the other side of the table has. That then translates through into a job as well, about if you're going to ask for support, you have to feel safe and comfortable that you can do that in the first place. So in order to access help, you need to be able to give that. They've also came back and said, actually, in lots of places, the routes to adjustments can be unclear. So even if you say, of this neurodivergence, it's, well, what help is there available? And now often there's a lot of organizations will have things like coaching. If you take KPMG, we have a thing where, recognizing that people will need time to recover from time to time, they have a specific job code that they can put time to recover to, and that's agreed as part of the adjustments for them. So that's something employers can do. But there's also something in terms of recognizing the energy that burnout and things like that take, or just sensory environments. I'm also very, very sensitive to light. I've got 3 pairs of super dark Oakley sunglasses that basically travel pretty much. It's quite hard for me not to have them with me, but without them, I'm in bits. But if somebody is dealing with that and that's burning so much energy, the employer needs to understand that this person isn't being lazy, isn't not putting the effort in. They're actually, in some ways, a bit like a swan pedaling harder than everybody else. And you need to make sure that things like that are addressed in performance management. Not sure. Am I still on point with your original question, Laura?
You absolutely are. And I think you've highlighted really nicely, actually, the many different levels at which we need to be thinking about, right from job seeking and recruitment through to when the person comes into the role and is supported to develop through various transitions, and to be able to thrive at different points. And actually, that's probably a really nice segue to Iveta, because presumably you cover all of those points. And as an employer, particularly if you don't have much knowledge about neurodivergence, or perhaps your structures may be a little bit rigid, I guess you might be a little bit anxious about how you have and enable an inclusive workplace. So what do employers do?
Very good question in terms of what employers do and what can they do. I think when it comes to overall workplaces and big companies, rather than just kind of looking at teams individually, it's really important to acknowledge that it is a two-way street, right? And what we find at National University Training is that there's this kind of double-sided knowledge and communication gap. On one side, you've got the managers or even the exec and the C-suite executives and the neurotypical colleagues who maybe want to provide support, but they're scared of saying the wrong thing, so they don't start the conversation. Or they have those anxieties around if we start talking about it, our request for reasonable adjustment is going to rise, and we can't handle that pressure on our HR department. Or that you might have managers who are not sure how to balance performance management with inclusion and support and welfare, without kind of the knowledge of realizing that actually the two go hand in hand and how can we support the two together. Because what we found is that when we deliver neurodiversity training to managers, let's take 10 of them, 2 of them could be the most neuro-inclusive people ever because they could be neurodivergent themselves or they have neurodivergent children. Another 2 have maybe done training in the past or they've attended a webinar like this, right? But the remaining 6 have no idea what neurodiversity actually even is. They might not even believe it's a thing. They might think, they have stereotypes about it. Not because they're inherently trying to be bad managers, but just because of bias and learning. It all comes back to education, right? And so it's actually much more about your personal experience and relationship with neurodiversity that matters when it comes to learning. And for us, it's about winning hearts and minds. How do we engage people to actually learn about this when they think it's not relevant to them? Then, of course, on the other hand, you've got those who are neurodivergent. And they probably have the knowledge that they're neurodivergent, right? Or maybe they've been diagnosed later in life, but might not really understand what the traits mean, how it impacts them. But again, there might be that communication gap, learning how to self-advocate, having the courage to, exactly as Richard said, the psychological safety piece, and that can be impacted by when you were disclosed. It can be impacted by your kind of family upbringing, past workplace experiences, and so on. So what we try to do is not just doing training for managers, but also actually for those who are neurodivergent, understanding your traits and how they present at work, and neurotypical colleagues as well. How do you work in diverse teams? So if it's an organization and they have nothing in place, not even a neurodiversity network or community like you do at KPMG, just starting the conversation, celebrating things like Neurodiversity Week in March to invite people in, right? It can be very scary and people can feel called out, but actually calling them in to the conversation and encouraging that curiosity. And what's really important to us is kind of looking at change management first. In making people aware that this is relevant to them. And if, talking about neurodiversity feels like too much, at the start I mentioned those statistics around retention, 50% of neurodivergent staff are looking to leave. If you are a manager or you're on the executive board, that's something you're going to care about, right? You're going to care about productivity. Neurodiverse teams with the right support, Harvard has shown they're 30% more productive, right? Because it benefits everyone. So also speaking their language, looking at what are the company's strategic objectives and aligning it with that. And then last but not least, sometimes very simply just starting the conversation. I think, as Richard said, having those champions is fantastic, but ultimately enabling managers to be more confident to actually have those conversations, be that through training, be that through having frameworks, even scripts of if someone discloses, how do you respond to that? And that's kind of the thing we found, that managers don't actually know that they're meant to respond to it in a certain way and offer specific support. And that can be as simple as having templates in your leadership training or your onboarding and so on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Abetta. And I think you've highlighted really nicely how this is everyone's business, even if people don't think it is. And one of the groups that we perhaps haven't spoken about yet is, we've spoken about the individual, we've spoken about the team, we've spoken about the employer, but also there's that policy level as well. Now, Karen, I know that you do a lot of policy engagement in your role at the University of Birmingham. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how research at Birmingham has been shaping and transforming government policy and why that matters. And I know a lot of your work's been in education, but I presume there's a lot of relevance to employment and that transition to adulthood as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's really important to make this point that it is important to influence policy because things have to change from the top down, but that in and of itself is not enough. And government and policymakers absolutely need us to be changing things on the ground as well. So I certainly wouldn't exclude that from when I talk about policy engagement. First of all, I think in terms of the university, I think the university is fantastic, really, in terms of the interdisciplinary research that we do in this area across various colleges and across various schools and across various subject areas. Just this morning, for example, I was meeting with colleagues from psychology, public health, and social policy who are all engaged in really excellent research in this area. So I think we've got something very unique at the university that we should be really celebrating. And specifically within the School of Education as well, that our work in and with schools, our work in partnership with neurodivergent populations, with schools, with policymakers is really important to all our work because it means we can be in touch with what really needs to change on the ground, and we can try and address that gap between research and practice and ensure that research is also informed by what's needed on the ground, for want of a better phrase. I mentioned the work that we've done around exclusion and marginalisation, but also one of our colleagues, Asa, for example, has done some really good work around the All Vision project, which was working with autistic students on developing inclusive curriculums in HE and guiding lecturers and teachers in HE. All of that is really, really important. So in terms of policy engagement, I think we don't just talk about one piece of research that we try and use to influence policymakers. I think a big part of what we need to do is developing a sense of the general culture in which evidence is recognised and is seen as being important. I think that's a really important issue, and higher education and universities have a very strong role to play in that and need to do more so that we ensure that there is an underpinning evidence base. And when I talk about evidence base, I talk about it quite broadly, and that includes taking on board the insider lived experience and insider perspectives, as well as looking at the research evidence in terms of studies and publications, as well as looking at what we often call the grey literature. And I think through policy engagement, we can advise on both specific issues and more general issues in terms of the kind of culture that needs to be created in the way that Iveta and Richard have talked about it. What does an enabling environment look like for all of us? And what is it that we cannot look at neurodivergent children, young people, or adults as being faulty? We really need to shift that perspective and get people to think about how we create those environments, but how we also really understand what the barriers to learning and participation might be, and to functioning in the workplace. I've been very, very fortunate in that I've been invited to sit on or to chair, first of all, the Neurodivergent Task and Finish group. And we worked with a really good group of people there over the course of about 9-10 months, a mix of clinicians, educators, policymakers, people with lived experience, academics, really good mix of people. And through that work, we were engaging with quite a broad range of stakeholders. So we could bring everything that we learned from that into a report, which is going to be published soon, which has then influenced the government in the development of the school's white paper. So it's important in that respect, because of course policy then shapes what happens on the ground. It shapes how decisions about resources are made. It shapes how for the school's white paper, how schools organise and manage and support neurodivergent children and young people. So yes, so I do really believe in the importance of engaging with policymakers and ensuring that what we do is also underpinned by and informed by research.
Thank you, Karen. I think it's an amazing example of how one of our University of Birmingham academics is really making a difference. It's brilliant to be able to showcase that here. And it's wonderful to see in the chat as well just how many members of our alumni community are here, including those who've been studying our courses in autism. So very, very welcome to all of you. And thank you to everyone as well who's been putting their questions in the chat and in the Q&A. We have a huge number of questions come in. So huge apologies if we're not able to get to all of the questions, but we will try our very, very best to get to as many as we can in the time possible. I'm going to come to a question from Belinda first, which I think is a really nice one because both you, Avetta and Richard, have spoken about the fact that you were diagnosed later in life. And Belinda's asking what support's available for people diagnosed later in life. And I asked in particular in relation to women who may be more likely to be diagnosed later on. But actually, I think that does apply across different genders as well. So it'd be really good to hear your thoughts around things like how you've navigated going from someone undiagnosed to diagnosed in the workplace, and if and how that may have changed anything. So I'll leave you two to decide who would like to answer that first.
Iveta, would you like to go first?
Sure, sounds good. So I think there's different aspects to that question in terms of late diagnosed, in terms of being a woman, and then also kind of age. The key thing I would say is take time to process it if you are someone who's been diagnosed late in life. Talking from my personal journey, when I was slowly kind of becoming aware and acknowledging that I am neurodivergent, it came with curiosity and then denial, and then acknowledgements, and then anger, and then acceptance. And it's important, I think, to go through all of those stages, especially also if you are diagnosed autistic, taking into account things like alexithymia, so struggling to put words to feelings and kind of processing your own emotions, is very important. And in some way as well, attending webinars like these and surrounding yourself with other neurodivergent people, I have to say, even just the last hour, seeing all the chats and messages of everyone who's on here who's neurodivergent, or even meeting Richard yourself, it is absolutely amazing to see that. So the first support I say has to come from yourself initially, that acceptance and kind of not mourning the person you used to be, but acknowledging that it's okay, that your life will probably change, right? And that with hopefully unmasking and knowing you're autistic and having that diagnosis will give you a sense of acceptance. If you are someone who's maybe having a career at that point in your life, then at work you can access support. You can also apply for access to work. But really importantly with this, I would highlight that you don't need a medical diagnosis to have the right to access support, which is actually a very common misconception. So often, though, of course, having a medical diagnosis can provide you with validation, and that is really important to someone's unmasking journey and kind of diagnosis journey. In terms of being a woman who gets diagnosed autistic, I can't recall any kind of specific government or healthcare initiatives are there to support with autism diagnoses. Unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, after diagnosis, that's that. You can maybe request an occupational health report, or if your employer provides training with someone like us, having training around what traits you have and how they impact you at work. But of course, privately, there are also routes where you can privately try and access therapy, depending on financial availability, or if you go through the NHS, if you're based in the UK, or depending on what part of the world you're in. If you are a woman and autistic or late diagnosed, I would very much recommend researching and learning a little bit more about how your kind of hormonal cycle can impact your autistic experiences as a woman, or if you're someone who menstruates, simply because that has a massive impact on being neurodivergent, and things like sensory sensitivity and so on. And often, of course, if you're not diagnosed later in life, you maybe wouldn't have had the opportunity to learn about that. And personally, for me, that was a very helpful topic to learn about.
Thank you, Abetta. Richard, I'm going to come to you with the same question, but also one of our attendees had a question around being late diagnosed, specifically that they asked to pose to you, which was around learning to cope with personal adjustments, but also inevitable setbacks following a diagnosis. So perhaps you can reflect on that in your response as well.
Yeah, I'll start off with those, and so I've been very, very lucky in the position I'm in that I have been able to access private support after my diagnosis, and I've done a lot of that. So setbacks point, one of the best things that one of the clinicians said to me, I don't know if anybody watches Grey's Anatomy or watched Grey's Anatomy, but one of the main characters, Richard, in that is an alcoholic. And there's a bit where he relapses, and someone asks him how long he's been sober, and he says, 20 years apart from the occasional blip. So he doesn't say, I'm back to zero. So you are going to have you've just got to keep an eye on the fact that you have progressed, and that if you get a setback, you're not back to zero. And I think that's a really, really important thing to keep in your head as you kind of get used to that kind of thing. I'm going to backtrack slightly. So I ended up being diagnosed, I don't know if accidentally is the right word or not. So I had some mental health problems, which I generally say have existed since I was about 13. That's probably more like 10, really. And I went, for various reasons, I went to go and get help for the first time. And they said, well, you do have these things, but we think they're secondary conditions for dealing with being autistic on your own for so long. And we need to know because the treatment plan goes like that or like that. So we can't actually help you without knowing this, which is where my diagnosis came from. Now, in terms of adjustments from that point, there's a couple of different groups I put them into. So some of the things that you do to yourself and for yourself, some of the things you do with people immediately around you, and some of the things you do with the employer. And I would try and put them into different buckets there. Managing yourself, for me, one of the most important things has been understanding your sensory profile. So what is it where actually you've got all kinds of sensory stress that you've probably treated as lots of unconnected things, and almost I tried to manage separately. So I used to have real problems in my eyes. Like, oh, I must have rubbed moisturizer in, or something like that. My eyes are killing me. I didn't go, actually, I've got complete light overload. There's all kinds of things where you can almost like make excuses for, oh, it's this, it's that, if you don't know what you're actually dealing with. And once you get your diagnosis, it's suddenly, you know what the target you're shooting at is. And I use the analogy of a computer chip with various wires coming into it carrying electricity. If all of those wires going up a bit get a bit more electricity, you can fry the chip in the middle. Or if one of them gets an extra surge of current down, you can fry the chip in the middle. So it's really about how you try and manage all of those feeds coming in, and also having an awareness of where you are. So one of the most useful questions that I got offered up that kind of live by is, what are you gritting through? What is it that you're doing and you've always done? But actually, if you stopped and thought about it, you'd realize your jaw was tense and you're clenching your teeth. So to give you an example, I have all kinds of sensory issues with food and textures. In the what you now call masking, I went to a work dinner or something like that, I would eat those things because I didn't want to stand out as the person that took a tiny little bit, shoved the plate to one side. I gritted through it. I don't do that anymore. If something's not right, I will quite happily just push it to the side. So if you start to focus on what you're gritting through, you start to get an idea of where your sensory stress points are. And that makes it a lot easier to figure out how you need to make personal adjustments for yourself. Because as you said already, Laura, there are some generalities, but a lot of things, and especially sensory profile, are very individual. So you need to figure out for yourself, where are your stress points? Where are the points where the circuit's being overloaded? So for me, it's the daft things. As sunglasses go everywhere. My noise cancelling headphones live in the right pocket of my jeans permanently. Two spare caps that live in my car, a spare pair of sunglasses live in my car. I've got caps in my work bag so I can shield myself from light if I need to. I prep a lot of food so that I make sure I've got the right kind of textures and flavors that I need to be able to survive and not overstress. So your personal adjustments have to be fitted to your own sensory profile. So that's the first bit. The next bit is people around you, and you've got to think about who you're going to tell and when, because somebody said, I think it's very good advice, you can only choose to tell somebody once. If you think you've made a mistake, you can't undo that. So you have to think about Why am I telling this person? Is there a good reason for it? And inevitably, you start with people that you trust. And actually, the more you do that and have conversations with the people you trust, it probably gets easier then to decide how and what you want to tell other people you maybe don't trust as much. There's also a point, I use an analogy of rugby with all of this. So if you play rugby, you're on the field because you want to be. It's your choice. You're there voluntarily, and this goes for everything from work through to social stuff. But you know tomorrow is going to hurt. There is an inevitable part of some of this where you kind of we do have extra sensory stresses and things because of the way our brains work. Some of this stuff is going to hurt, but actually we want to do it. So some of it is an acceptance of that, and tracking your data is really important. So I've got roughly 40 points of information I collect on myself every day to try and figure out, am I in the amber? Am I heading into the red? So daft things like, if somebody cuts you up in traffic, do you get sweary when you're not normally? For me, that's quite a big signal that where I go, hang on a second, I'm not quite as calm as I thought I was. What's going on? Do I need to do some reset processes? And then when it comes to work, it's different employers will do different things. But one of the first things I would say in terms of adjustments is if you have any kind of neurodivergent community in your workplace, join it and put a question out to people and go, look, what works for you? What have you asked for? What's actually worked? Because there will be somebody somewhere in your organization that knows some of that stuff. If you start to see someone, well, actually, that person's got a similar kind of problem with light to me. What are they doing? Okay, let's try that. I would say three different things: what you do for yourself, for a group of trusted people, and your employer. And some of it is just getting used to it. I will now, and my team's I'm open with my team. I will say, you know what, I'm having a bad week this week. I'm going to get to things slower than normal. If I'm in meetings and the light's overwhelming me, I'll get up and close the blinds. I'll sit there in meetings sometimes with my sunglasses on, which I would never have done a few years ago. I would never have stood out like that. The other thing that my clinical psychologist has said about noise cancelling headphones, she said there's a difference with people late diagnosed and early diagnosed. She said the younger people, they wear their headphones all straight away as a matter of course. People that are late diagnosed, you have to try and teach them to put them in to protect themselves and to get used to the fact that it's okay to stand out a little bit. Are you okay, Lauren?
That's really interesting. And your focus there, particularly about managing and navigating your environment and personal adjustments, was really interesting because one of the environments that is often the most busy and the most chaotic is a school environment. And we've had a question from Fee who asks about recruiting more neurodivergent people into the teaching profession. And I wonder if I could pose this question to you, Karen. So Fee's a senior leader in a secondary school, is conscious of the rigidity of the school and the overwhelming environment. How can schools work better for neurodivergent teachers?
I think that is a really, really good question. And it does come back to a lot of what both Yvette and Richard have talked about in terms of acceptance, in terms of understanding your staff and the leadership being very committed to recruitment of neurodivergent teachers. But I do think also that notion of having people that you can turn to who can support you, who is part of your trusted circle, who you can talk to really about your own insight into the issues that you might want to and need to address and deal with. I think we are seeing more and more neurodivergent teachers in the classroom. And again, I think that if schools could become more overtly celebrate the strengths of those teachers and what they bring to the school environment, that would be really, really useful as well. I was thinking about a particular example in a school, and this isn't related to neurodivergent teachers, but actually I thought it was really interesting in relation to a group of children and young people. I spoke to a teacher the other day who worked in a school in Haringey, and he was talking about the fact that they work very hard on developing an environment that celebrates and enables inclusion and belonging. And they have a number of autistic and neurodivergent children and young people in the school. And one of the neurodivergent young people had decided that what he wanted to do was to create a better kind of group and connections of neurodivergent young people in the school, and that they would do social events together, and they would be supporting one another in issues that maybe the kind of challenges that they were facing, but also in terms of advocating to teachers and to the school about what they needed and what was important to them. And it was actually beautiful to listen to this teacher talk about it, because he said it was transformative for the staff, because what this group of young people did is there was a younger neurodivergent student that came into the school, was really, really unconfident, felt very worried, and didn't really want to disclose to anybody, which was fair enough. But they brought him into the fold of their group, and they had social events together and did a number of activities together. And it culminated in them actually asking the school leadership to be able to run an assembly, and they would run it in the way that they wanted to do it. The teacher told me that as you sat in the assembly, you would have heard a pin drop, and he'd never seen the whole school be so focused on what these young people were delivering. And he said it did more to turn around the perception of the peers and to welcome all of them into the school than anything that the teachers had ever done. So I think that notion of giving neurodivergent people the chance to kind of work with other neurodivergent people and with their peer groups, and put forward that very positive narrative about strengths, and at the same time find help with the challenges. And I think what Yvette and Richard are talking about are really important in that respect, and they've illustrated it beautifully with much better examples than I have. But I do think primarily acceptance, being curious, being attracted by difference. We need schools where that happens much more, and where that's embedded into the whole culture of the school.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karen. The next question I was going to put to Avetta, which was around whether there might be any kinds of jobs that you might advise someone who is neurodivergent to avoid. One may think that would be the school, but I think Karen's quite clearly articulated that would not be the case if the culture was right. So I don't know if you want to reflect on whether there might be any jobs that someone who's neurodivergent might want to avoid, or whether it's more about the culture and the environment.
I think my literal autistic brain doesn't want to say, avoid this, avoid that, do this, don't do that. And I think I'll flip it more into kind of a positive, looking at, okay, what jobs would you actually maybe should lean to if you're neurodivergent, right? Rather than avoid. And if you are someone who is an ADHDer, right, all of our sales team and national neurodiversity training are ADHDers, because you might be someone who is quite energetic and you love the novelty of meeting new people and speaking to 20 new people a day, right? So that will make you fantastic at a sales role. Equally, if you are someone who's autistic and very detail orientated and structured, you'll be really great at pattern recognition, and that leans well into tech, finance, and engineering. About 53% of people in tech are neurodivergent or autistic, even though companies find that only about 3%, right? But that's, again, disclosure rates, psychological safety. Equally, people who have OCD make really great risk assessors. So I think it comes back to understanding yourself, understanding your traits, kind of what Richard said around understanding your sensory profile as well. And then, very importantly, understanding the job and the role. And that applies to, neurodivergent and neurotypical, especially if you're someone who's young and starting your career, or even no matter your age, if you're switching careers or switching industries, making sure you actually understand what the role entails on a day-to-day basis, including in terms of things like executive functioning, the team around you, the support you'll get, who you're communicating with, so on. And then, very importantly, when it comes to, what role is right for you as a neurodivergent individual, what we found when it comes to retention is that actually neurodivergent people's decision-making process for picking a certain employer is different than for neurotypical people, right? The key decision factor for neurotypical people tends to be income, right? How much money are you going to make? Which is completely understandable. You get a job to make an income. But for neurodivergent people, that often tends to be actually the second or the third decision factor, where the first is, Laura, as you said, the culture. But it can even be things like how far is the job if you have to be there in the office every single day? How accessible is an environment? Do you have flexibility? Can you work from home? So it's actually those small things that are perceived as small that are far more important for neurodivergent people. And I think it's very easy, especially for young people coming out of education or people who are switching careers, new kind of to employment, to conform to neurotypical norms around how you pick a job or how you pick what industry and role is right for you, to really reflect on what are your traits, what are your strengths, plus of course the culture. Does the company have a neurodiversity community? Do they have champions and all those kind of initiatives in place already or not?
Thank you very much, Avetta. And I think you've spoken a lot there about, a person making sure the job is right for them and finding the right environment, but also the importance of those around. And I've got a question that's come in that I thought I'd put to you, Richard. And it's from someone who's been watching a neurodivergent colleague of theirs being maneuvered out of their job. And I wondered if you had any reflections on those kinds of situations where, for whatever reason, something might not be going too well in employment and how a person might navigate that and what support they might need.
I think that is a really difficult situation, and obviously, shooting from the hip answer, I think one of the first problems for a neurodivergent person in that kind of situation is they might not realize they're being maneuvered out, set up. And I have examples of that in my own career. Somebody asks you, so, oh, I'm going into this meeting, I need to know this. And it seems like an innocent question, and you later find out from somebody else in the meeting that there was a very definite agenda to what you were asked, and you basically are being set up. So the first difficulty, I think, is just realizing what's going on, because if it gets to a point where it's too late and you haven't had a chance to represent your views and everything else before all those decisions are made and before somebody has, on a better phrase, formed a consensus within the organization for what they're doing, that's really hard. So this is very good advice at all, but I think the only thing you can do in that situation is try and get help. Now, most organizations, first of all, in this day and age, will have an HR process, speak up champions, things like that. And they are probably what I'd give as the best advice on that. Don't try and deal with, you try and do that on your own, you're almost certainly going to fail. So the fact that company and work culture has changed so much, especially in big businesses in the last 10 or 15 years, I would say you need to make the most of that. But the businesses have those kind of processes for a reason, and they've been put in. There is someone somewhere in the organization that believes in them, even if it's not immediately apparent at the level you're dealing with. So I think the only practical advice on that is that you have to sort of say, right, what are those mechanisms, and assess them, even if it's just to have a quiet without necessarily escalating something at the earliest possible opportunity.
Thank you, Richard. And one of the things you touched upon there was around beliefs. And one of the questions we've had that's come in is around the fact that there's a lot of information being shared on social media around things like neurodiversity and mental health. And people have been, I think there's been some degree of skepticism around neurodivergence and whether it might be overdiagnosed, for example. And Karen, I wondered if I could come to you in relation to this point, because obviously it has implications for education as well as employment. If someone goes to their employer and explains that they're neurodivergent, or maybe it might put them off a little bit. But do you have any advice or guidance around that you could share, or any thoughts around those kinds of tensions?
Yeah, it's quite a biggie and quite a difficult one at the moment, because I think we all know that a little information can sometimes be quite a dangerous thing, and a lot of what's on social media does kind of, it isn't all helpful. Some of it is, and it isn't all helpful. I think there is also a lot of discussion more broadly about that notion of whether there is overdiagnosis. And I think there's a whole load of factors that come into this. There's long waiting lists for diagnostic assessments, actually longer waiting lists for children and young people than there are for adults, for example. And I think we have to just, on that, I want to really emphasize Yvette's point about access to support does not need a diagnosis. We do have to be really, really clear about that. Diagnostic assessment can be really important for a lot of people, and we've heard from both Richard and Yvette how important it is. But we must, in education, we're very clear now that we need to uncouple diagnostic assessment from educational assessment, that we cannot hang about and wait for a diagnostic assessment before we provide early and timely support for a child or a young person. So there's that issue. Then there's the broader issue that you're raising around the debates around overdiagnosis, and kind of a lot of blurring really about our understandings, maybe that might not always be that helpful. I do know that there is, I mean, I do think this is important actually, but it has to be conducted very carefully. I have been asked to be part of the Department of Health and Social Care review into prevalence rates in mental health, ADHD and diagnosis. And I know a lot of us have been quite worried about that whole narrative around overdiagnosis. But I think what this review is really aiming to do is to look what is the evidence, but not to look at it just from a health perspective, because I think it's really important not to be narrow in that way, but to understand what are the drivers, what is it that's influencing the fact that people feel that they really need to move towards, that more people are going for diagnostic assessment and that there's such a rise in those numbers. And those factors are multitudinal, you know, they can partly be related to the fact that we aren't providing the right kind of support within education. There are all sorts of social pressures. The kind of politics around identity are really, really strong at the moment. I think there is a number of different factors that come into this. But we do need to recognise that for many, diagnostic assessment is really, really important. And I'm absolutely not arguing against that. But we also need to be really clear that support should not depend on that. And we have to be careful not to rely too much on social media for our information. We have to be able to be critical about looking at the information that's presented to us through whatever channel that happens to be.
Brilliant, thanks, Karen. I know one of the big things that you are campaigning for is that, as well as supporting someone to understand what a diagnosis means for them, actually just even understanding your needs with or without that diagnosis is really important. And I think kind of your work is focused on education, but I think that really applies to the workplace as well.
And sorry, Laura, it's also about other people understanding your needs and your challenges. Of course, I know that I think is absolutely crucial. Yeah,
and that's a really important clarification. Thank you, Karen. I can't believe that we're approaching the end of the webinar now. The time really, really has flown. But I do want to pose one last question to our panel members. So the question that's come in is that if you had a magic wand, from your perspective, what change would you like to see that would make the most help in terms of neurodiversity? And that can be in relation to employment or more generally. If I go Yvette, Richard, Karen.
Sure. So the change that I would love to see in terms of neurodiversity that I think would have the most impact would be just going from awareness to behavioural change. I'd like to believe that most people and most organisations have a decent, basic understanding of what neurodiversity is. But what we've seen at National Neurodiversity Training is that not everyone actually understands how it impacts you at work or in your personal life. But most importantly, how do we move that awareness, that knowledge of, oh, these are the traits, to how do we implement support and change our behaviour so that we can support people around us and ultimately benefit the whole team and the whole business, and of course individual neurodivergent people too. And that takes time and learning. It's not going to happen overnight, but hopefully that's what we're here to do all together.
Amazing, thank you, Yvette. Richard, the same question to you.
have the idea of what I want to say, but I think I'm going to be far less articulate in how I get it across. So there is a persistent problem that comes up in lots of different places about autistic people and finding it difficult to make friends and loneliness, which has an impact on all aspects of life, be it outside work and in work. Um, so if I had a magic wand, I think I would like, as I say, this, I told you this was going to be a less articulate version. I would like something that allowed people to understand more that autistics aren't a bunch of loners, that actually we do want to be involved in social stuff. It just comes at a much higher cost to us, and a bit more understanding and inviting in sometimes. Because I think that would have a huge impact on autistic lives, both in and outside work. One other thing I did want to say, and Laura has given me permission for this, so I'll go. Someone was asking earlier, and Karen was making the point that support shouldn't depend on diagnosis and what do you do with once you get a diagnosis. There's a very, very good book by Dr. Luke Bearden from Sheffield Hallam University called Autism in Adults, which is quite short, very, very practical. I really like it. I find it more practical than his later books, but it's on Amazon. If you're just looking for some practical tips that just get to the point, you could do a lot worse than reading that book. Thank you for giving me permission on that.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. And Karen, to you now.
Thank you. Yes, it is a great book. And I'm not going to say anything. What I'm going to say is not going to be different. I think from Veta and Richard, I think I like that concept from awareness to behavior change. And I absolutely would endorse the fact that what we need to be looking at is how those of us who aren't neurodivergent in particular need to be really thinking about how we interact, how we communicate, how we contribute to enabling environments. And in education, we talk about, we really want to develop a culture amongst teachers, which is curiosity based, where you really want to understand a person because you want to understand their inner life and what makes them act in the way they do and how that impacts on how you need to change the way that you interact and communicate. I think if we could move in that way, if we can move forward in that way, I think that would be such a positive change. And that would also lead to the confidence that people need to advocate for what they need from the environment around them as well, which I'd really like to see some change there, that we support people to be able to advocate for themselves as well. And we will advocate too, as neurotypical.
Some really important points there. And maybe we may not have a physical magic wand, but I think if everyone on this webinar waved their hypothetical one and brought about some of these changes or did one little thing to work towards them, I think that could start to make a really big difference as well. So that brings us to the end of our event today. First, I just want to say a huge thank you to our really wonderful panel for sharing their insights and expertise. It's been a really fantastic discussion. So on behalf of Bringing Birmingham to you, a huge, huge thank you. And also to all of our attendees, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Wherever you are in the world, we really hope you enjoyed the conversation and hopefully we'll see you at one of the future events. The next event should be going in the chat and they look incredible. How much is a year of life worth? And also dinosaur detectives. So do check them out. You'll also get a follow-up email tomorrow where you can find out more about some of the topics covered today. And also your feedback's really, really welcome. So there's a link in the chat to a short feedback survey, but that will also be in the follow-up email that you'll receive as well. So right on time, all I've got left to say is thank you again, everyone, and goodbye from us.